Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America, written by Stacey Patton. Chapter 1, A Family Conversation. This book isn't just about hitting children. It's about Black children and freedom. It's also a book about Black America and our pain. It's an examination of history, racism, trauma, crime and policing, media, child welfare policy, science and medicine, popular culture, religion, humor, schooling, sexuality, and who gets to be a child in America. At a historical moment when young people around this country are declaring to the world that Black lives matter, that Black girls rock, and that they are magical, it's clear that the tides have changed. Our children want to breathe. Their hands are up. Don't shoot. They don't want to be stopped. They don't want to be frisked. They don't want to be told to police their bodies in public spaces or to hold their tongues. They don't want to be forced to lie down on filthy sidewalks and submit to the injustice of the moment. They don't want to be the next Freddie Gray or Sandra Bland, portrayed as a thug in the news or turned into yet another heartbreaking hashtag on social media. They are not alone. Their parents and loved ones don't want them to experience such injustices either. They want their children to have opportunities to grow up to become healthy, thriving adults. This has been the cry of generations of Black parents since slavery. These fears and elusiveness of these simple hopes have been central to the struggle of Black lives for all that time. But over the past few years, we've been caught in an endless cycle of grieving. The killings of unarmed Black people by cops and the senseless street murders of our young people by other Blacks in cities across this country have elevated parents' fears and left them wondering how to protect their children. The body count has also intensified debates over physical punishment. We live in a country where pregnant Black women still have to ask the same ethical question that civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois posed a little more than a century ago. Is it worthwhile? Ought children be born to us? Have we any right to make human souls face what we face today? These days, even white parents have written about the fears that they have for Black children that they're raising. They share Black parents' frustrations over their inability to protect their adopted and biological children from the racial harms outside their homes. The cold, hard truth is that we live in a country where Black children don't get to be children. They face a culture that questions their intellectual abilities and slanders their humanity at every turn, and a criminal justice system that subjects them to adult penalties, even for first-time offenses. Black 4- and 5-year-olds are 18% of the country's preschoolers, but make up nearly half of out-of-school suspensions for toilet mishaps, crying, and throwing tantrums. By age 10, Black children are considered less innocent than young white children and are perceived to be older than they actually are, especially by police officers. And the darker their complexion, the more likely they are to receive harsh punishment, including paddling with wooden boards from school teachers and administrators, and long sentences from the courts. We live in a society where Black children who end up in the emergency room are less likely to receive pain medications because white people do not believe Black people experience physical pain in the same way. Where a teenage boy can walk into the store, buy an iced tea and candy, where a teenage boy can't walk into the store to buy iced tea and candy without being stalked and shot by a neighborhood watchman, where a Black girl can be yanked out of her seat by her neck and tossed across the classroom by a school resource officer. We live in a society where a 12-year-old boy playing in the park gets mistaken as a 22-year-old man and is shot dead by the police within seconds. Where a teenage boy can't hang out with his friends playing rap music in a car without being killed by a white man irritated by the loud beats. Where a Black teen's dead body can lie in the street, baking in the sun for 4 hours in front of his parents and a traumatized community. Where the legal system insists time and again that Black children are responsible for their own deaths. Where adults debate whether unarmed children deserve to die because of their size, because they stole something, because they got suspended from school or smoked marijuana in the past. We live in a country where the suicide rates among elementary-age Black children have nearly doubled since the 90s. while suicide rates among white children have fallen. According to a 2015 report from the Journal of American Medical Association, researchers pinpoint exposure to violence and traumatic stress, as well as aggressive school discipline and a higher likelihood of early onset puberty as possible risk factors. This trend should not be surprising, given the country's treatment of Black people. On top of their own pain, our children are receptive to what their parents and elders are feeling, displaying, discussing, and experiencing. There are so many traps for our young: drugs, mass incarceration, neighborhood and gang violence, racist teachers, the school-to-prison pipeline, sex traffickers, trigger-happy cops, and predatory foster care system. The George Zimmermans and Darren Wilsons of the world, poisoned tap water, the list goes on. There's a lot to be afraid of. Given these ugly realities, it's not a surprise that Black parents are telling their children whatever they need to in order to keep them safe. Work twice as hard, be 3 times as good, pull up your pants, take off that hoodie, cut those dreadlocks, act right around white folks, don't make sudden movements, keep your hands out of your pocket, don't mouth off at the cops, and don't run from them even if you're scared. Black parents have always searched for armor to protect their children from people who instinctively see them as threats. Another way Black parents try to protect and love their children is by physically punishing them. Whether we call it whipping, beating, spanking, or loving discipline, for many, not to hit is considered neglectful and irresponsible Black parenting. Our religious leaders preach this. Neighbors enforce it. Comedians and radio personalities joke about it. Political leaders claim it will save our communities, lead to peace in our streets, and keep young Black bodies out of jail and the morgue. Millions of people give a virtual thumbs up on social media when they see viral videos of parents physically punishing or shaming their kids. And far too many of us will even argue that whooping kids is a Black thing, as if it's behavior we are genetically predisposed to and can't change. But corporal punishment is not a Black thing. Between 70 and 80% of all Americans hit children. National surveys have varied over the years. Still, this book is solely focused on corporal punishment within the Black community. It's an effort to understand how whipping children became so deeply embedded in our culture as good parenting. I ask, why do so many Black people have faith that whipping will keep our children safe? Why do we consider our physical and emotional pain and the scars left behind to be signs of strength, even though our security and health in this country remain precarious? Why do so many of us believe that our personal achievements or the fact that we haven't been jailed or killed should be attributed to this painful whippings? Although we have been making these arguments for generations, Black children should not have to feel the burning sting of centuries-old whip to learn or to be kept safe. My big assertion is this: the violence our children face from the police, school systems, the streets, and from their parents is all interconnected. It's what one of my Facebook friends calls strange and bitter fruit from the same tree. The belief that we need to whip our kids to keep them in line is deeply grounded in our collective psyche. In much the same way that racists believe Black folks are culturally deficient and police officers disproportionately see us reaching for guns when we're actually reaching for IDs. I've heard too many Black mothers say, for example, if I don't whip my son's behind now, he'll knock me down later. These mothers were usually talking about toddlers or young adolescent boys. Their words demonstrate how racist ideas about the potential criminality and violence of Black males seeps into Black parents' thinking about their own children. This book is going to challenge some of our long-held beliefs about physically punishing children. It makes the private conversation public. I realize that I'm committing a cultural taboo by airing our dirty laundry. I'm also fully aware that Black parents, especially Black mothers, are already publicly, routinely criticized and blamed for our poverty, crime, and countless other issues. I'm not trying to add to the chorus of stereotyping hate that sees Black parenting as the source of society's problems. But the deification of Black mothers is just as damaging as white racist stereotypes against them. Thanks in part to the late rap artist Tupac Shakur, the black mother is the only woman in our community who can be a crackhead and a black queen at the same time. We put mama on a pedestal and hesitate to call her out because she's holding up our families, often by herself. But that doesn't make it okay for her to beat the black off us. That kind of celebration excuses accountability for parenting practices that are damaging to the overall well-being of black children. We have to talk about this. This book may also bring up some old wounds. It gets to the very foundation of what many of us have been taught by family, church, and society. But when it comes to discussions about hurting children's bodies, my number one concern is not hurting children's bodies. The only empathy I have for the adults who hit children comes from the fact that many of them are doing the only thing they know how to do. After all, most American parents were hit as children, and there's no universal parenting program designed to educate parents about the harms of hitting or non-physical alternatives. It's unrealistic to expect that people whose brains have been wired to hit children and not see it as an act of violence will intuitively do the opposite. If you have children and hit them, you might feel discomforted by the fact that your actions are connected to the trauma of the whippings you received as a child. It might piss you off to hear me say that you didn't turn out fine because of the whippings, but that you either turned out fine in spite of the pain that you are, or that you are a survivor of unrecognized trauma. It might tick you off to hear me say that there are lots of folks walking around who may have been abused and don't even know it. My hope is that this book will be so disturbing that it'll make it difficult for people to continue hitting children in peace. I have an idea of where resistance will come from, though. Everybody is always up in black folks' business trying to tell us how to handle our lives, and we put up with this everywhere, but our homes belong to us. They may not be perfect, but they're ours. We're not going to have anybody coming into the only space that we have telling us what to do with the bodies of the children that we created, feed, clothe, pray for, and worry about all day, every day. It doesn't matter if it's our neighbors, our teachers, medical, legal, or psychological experts, child protective services, the government, or even somebody like me, a young black woman who doesn't have children at all. No matter what, we believe it's our right to teach and discipline our children the way we see fit. But there's little acknowledgement that the world is much more open today than any other point in human history. We know a lot more now thanks to science. But instead of adapting our parenting approach, we meet the challenge of our current world. There are still many of us who long for the good old days, when kids didn't act so bad and knew their place. We believe that the good old days were safer. The family unit was intact. There was no war on drugs, and schools didn't need metal detectors. People could get a good paying job and a house with only a high school diploma. Men settled scores with their fists, not guns. With so much going on in the world, there are a lot of reasons why kids seem different today. Is it really because we're not whipping them enough? Tough love is often cited as the reason for more idyllic era. In the good old days, if you got out of line at home, you went to the backyard and picked your own switch. Lots of us had to do this. I had to do it myself. Switches, belts, extension cords, wire hangers, shoes, and basically any object within reach was fair game for my married, black, middle-class adopted mother, who whipped me. I wasn't always beaten this way, of course. Sometimes it was a milder pop with her hand, but it all hurt. It made me cry. It all made me afraid of her, which was the point to hear my elders tell it. They say that if my adoptive mother didn't nip my behavior in the bud, bad things were doomed to happen. I'd try to rule over her, flunk out of school, become a teen mom, do jail time, or end up in an early grave. This is a situation we all recognized, but it was not unusual for my adoptive mother to take things much further. I still have the physical scars from all those whippings, and I spent the bulk of my childhood in New Jersey's foster care system until I aged out at 18. It's my experience with physical, verbal, and emotional abuse in my adoptive parents' home that sparked my interest in the historical treatment of black children during and after slavery. I had a suspicion that my whippings, though meted out solely by my adoptive mother, had something to do with history. She whipped me like her parents whipped her, and like her grandparents whipped her parents, and like her great-grandparents whipped her grandparents, and like Massa whipped her great-great-grandparents. When I was a doctoral student in African American history at Rutgers University, I learned that the larger cultural devaluation of Black adults and children informs the way Black parents discipline their children. The lingering effects from trauma of centuries of slavery and post-emancipation racism has produced what acclaimed author Joy DeGruy has described as multi-generational maladaptive behaviors that continue to be passed on from Black parents. These parents suffer from chronic stress and from what's known as post-traumatic stress syndrome, which we inherited from our enslaved ancestors. DeGruy's theory is similar to the results of research by doctors at New York Mount Sinai Hospital, who discovered that Jewish descendants of Holocaust survivors have undergone changes in their genes as a result of their parents' trauma. Those inherited stress-related genes can shape the way people cope with their environment and manifest in poor physical and mental health and social dysfunction. This passed-on trauma has not only led to the adoption of whoopings as a parenting method, it has also indoctrinated this same behavior in people's children and their children's children long after this kind of punishment lost its relevance as a survival tactic on plantations and during the racial terror of Jim Crow. The white culture that traumatized generations of Black people and taught them to fear the whip now continues to blame and criminalize us for the results. In my child advocacy work and during my career as a journalist over the past decade, I've interviewed scores of scientists, parents, children, child abuse survivors, and child welfare experts all around the country. Then, during the 2014 Adrian Peterson child abuse controversy and debates over the actions of Toya Graham, the infamous Baltimore mom, who went upside her son's head during a race ride in April 2015, I took a lot of heat when I appeared on national television and said these parents, regardless of their intentions, were wrong for hurting their children's bodies. I was adamant that a parent's intent does not trump the impact of violence against a child. In our media moment, we quickly reacted to those controversies, but then the country moved on from those stories without necessary reflection, analysis, and solutions. And so, here I am, continuing the conversation with this book. Some of you may dismiss this book as biased, assuming that the abuse I endured during my childhood clouds my opinion about, quote, reasonable corporal punishment. Guilty as charged. My whippings and my scars shape the person that I am today, and the book in front of you. But I'm not alone in my thinking. My views are equally shaped by data and ample research, which demonstrate the destructiveness of any level of hitting children. I see all forms of hitting as acts of violence, and I believe that children should enjoy the same right to bodily integrity as adults. Experts in the business of understanding child development and parenting practices universally affirm that there's no solid science to suggest that hitting children to any extent and regardless of race or ethnic background is good for them or for society. There is plenty of scientific evidence, however, demonstrating the long-term damage resulting from these types of punishment. This is true even when spankings don't leave marks or other serious physical injuries. The effects might not be apparent for years until after puberty or early adulthood. Studies by researchers at a number of universities have shown that corporal punishment and chronic stress have a negative impact on children's brain development. As a child grows, certain parts of the brain are particularly vulnerable to stress. Constant hollering, belittling, threatening, and hitting sets off biochemical responses that can change the architecture of a child's brain and lay the groundwork for low IQ, quick temper, aggressiveness, hypervigilance, delinquency, depression, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, future domestic violence, and inability to regulate impulses, dysfunctional relationships, and early intrusive sexual thoughts and activities. This abundance of research has not changed public opinion or practice. So why don't we listen to the evidence? Why do we continue hitting our children when we remain on the bottom rung of every measurement of health and progress? We're the most locked up, unhealthy, stressed out, demonized group of people in America. Whipping children hasn't saved us from any of this. We've been whooping for centuries, and we've not turned out fine as a people. Could it be that all of that violence is the one root cause of our problems? How committed are we to passing on trauma to future generations? Are we devoted to pain and suffering and being victims? I understand the immediate urge to defend Black spaces, Black parents, and Black culture and identity. But we should consider that maybe, just maybe, white supremacy has done a masterful job of getting its victims of centuries of racial oppression to continue its trauma work and convinced us all to call it love. If we insist on continuing this whooping tradition, let's at least acknowledge what we're really doing, where this errant programming really comes from, and what the real long-term consequences are. I also recognize that we understandably have a profound distrust of white experts. After all, these are all the same professionals who use science, medicine, statistics, and the media to call us inferior and pathological, and to shore up their own sense of identity and mythical sense of superiority. How do you trust the people who tell you to stop beating your kids when they're constantly creating and sustaining the conditions that compel us to do what we feel we need to maintain our kids' safety? It's a cruel double-edged sword. And yet, yearly statistics gathered by the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System consistently show that Black children are mistreated and killed by their family members at significantly higher rates than white and Latino kids. Social workers and district attorneys will tell you that most of these family members aren't monsters. They see a slap across the face or a seemingly innocuous pop sometimes result in a serious injury or even a fatality. Other cases escalate slowly. Parents don't start off with extension cords. It gets to that point when they believe a belt or a hand no longer works. In fact, many district attorneys that I've talked to over the years say it's not bad parents intentionally hurting their kids who end up with convictions for child abuse or homicide. It's those who started spanking and amped up as the child got bigger. We tell ourselves that what we're doing is different, saying, well, I wouldn't whip my child with a switch or an extension cord. I wouldn't leave welts or bruises or break bones. I wouldn't make my child bleed. I wouldn't whip them when I'm angry. I would sit them down and explain to them why they're being punished. But I'm here to tell you that I have read hundreds of case files. And those parents who got that knock on the door from Child Protective Services and who found themselves standing in front of a judge being convicted for abuse said the same things. They were genuinely shocked when they were told that their parenting practices were against the law. Until that moment, they too had been told that this was the right way to raise a Black child. It was the way that they were raised. They didn't end up in the emergency room. Their mom and them didn't go to jail. And getting whooped and scarred with weapons wasn't called abuse. Black people, we must rethink our approach. In 2014, Black children who made up around 14% of the total child population accounted for 24% of children in foster care, according to the most recent annual report by the Children's Bureau. Factors such as low birth weight, crushing poverty, having a young mother, low education, and having no father listed on the birth certificate place children at a higher risk for being reported to CPS, which are highly concentrated in poor Black neighborhoods. If we're honest, the child welfare industry in this country is about policing poverty and reinforcing the powerlessness of people of color. When we hit our children, we put them at risk of becoming among the thousands of Black children who enter the foster care system every year and have a 50% longer stay than children of other races, which is the express lane to the juvenile justice system and ultimately to adult prison. Our youth, who are often bounced from home to home and placed in facilities far away from their parents and everything they know, often fail to get adopted or returned home, which puts them more at risk for not graduating from high school or transitioning into independent living. When we hit Black children, we put them at risk for being suspended and expelled from school and becoming yet another victim in the school-to-prison pipeline. When we hit Black children, we put them at risk for entering a foster care system that forces disempowered young people to take psychotropic medications against their will. Seriously. In 2015, A 2015 report from the Franklin Law Group, a child advocacy organization based in Baltimore, found that since the 1990s, when I was in the foster care system, there has been a 55% increase in the prescribing of psychotropic medications to foster kids. Foster kids, including infants, are prescribed mind-altering drugs at rates 9 times higher than children who are not in foster care. I've met kids in care who were taking 4 or 5 psychotropic medications at a time, even though there was no real medical evidence to support their regimens. Black children, especially girls, are diagnosed with higher rates and prescribed off-label medications with black box warnings indicating that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does not sanction the drug for children. The ramifications of this are staggering. Numerous reports on the unregulated medication of children have found that long-term use of these drugs causes serious side effects and long-term consequences. Taking these medications can suppress and disrupt normal brain development and function, alters chemical levels in the brain, and impacts mood and behavior, according to Baltimore Law Group report. They've also been found to cause neurological disorders, the development of breasts in boys, brain shrinkage, obesity, cardiovascular issues, violent behavior, suicidal ideations, restlessness, low energy, aggression, diabetes, insomnia, memory loss, and shortening of the lifespan by 25 years. The drugs are often prescribed for traumatized and grieving children as a way to control their behaviors in lieu of counseling services, which are often not available because they're more expensive than drugs. Kids labeled violent, explosive, or difficult become easier to manage when they're chemically sedated. Knowing this, it should be no surprise that Black children are stereotyped as being angry or overly aggressive. Intentionally or not, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This explains why a largely white social services system and psychiatric community misdiagnose and overmedicate our youth. When we whoop our children, we also put them at risk of joining tens of thousands of young people who age out of the foster care system and then often struggle badly, with more than 1 in 5 becoming homeless after age 18. Instead of making a successful transition into productive adulthood, one national study found that 38% of former foster youth had emotional problems and chronic health conditions. 50% had used illegal drugs. Only 48% had graduated from high school by the time they left the system. Fewer than 3% had earned a college degree, and 71% of young women had gotten pregnant. They also faced higher rates of unemployment and public assistance, and their own children were more likely to need foster care. And 1 in 4 ended up in prison within 2 years of leaving the foster care system. With all this data, I find it shocking that hitting children is still actually legal, while hitting between adults is considered a crime, and hitting an animal is defined as cruelty. While theoretical and rarely enforced, laws even protect people in prison from corporal punishment. But with children, state laws actually define how to strike a child's body appropriately. Why don't we extend the same courtesy to children that we do to prisoners, to dogs? A 2008 study by Elizabeth Gershoff at University of Texas developmental psychologist found that a whopping 85% of children have been physically punished by their parents by the time they reach high school. The late Murray Strauss, a former sociology professor and an expert on corporal punishment who passed away during the writing of this book, examined numerous surveys taken over several decades. He found that the number of parents who spank their children or admitted to spanking admitted that spankings are sometimes necessary, slowly dropped from around 90% in 1968 to about 70% in 1994. This number has remained fairly steady in recent years. These findings cut across racial and class lines. Still, a number of researchers across the country have found that Black families report using physical punishment 10% more than parents from other communities. I often hear Black folks complain that The problems we face in our communities are a result of a generation of bad children who are disrespectful, spoiled, entitled, and aren't being spanked enough. You've probably heard the popular complaint, they made it a crime to discipline our kids. But while the numbers show a decrease in spanking, America is still a country that hits its young. If the majority of Americans are slapping, spanking, popping, whipping, or beating their kids, then is it really true that the smaller proportion of kids who aren't being hit are responsible for the violence and crime in our society? As parenting expert L.R. Nost notes in Jesus, the Gentle Parent, it's more likely that when children learn to hit and hurt, that might is right, and that violence is the answer to their problems and an outlet to stress, they take those lessons out into the world. The problem isn't kids today, Nost argues, but rather the problem is that with parents who repeat the patterns that their own parents set with societies who view normal stages of child development as somehow abnormal. Meanwhile, children are still being hit at school. Every state except Iowa and New Jersey allows teachers and administrators in private and parochial schools to paddle students. And 19 states still allow public school students to be hit with wooden boards. A disproportionate number of students disciplined this way are Black. Unlike their white counterparts, Black parents overwhelmingly sign opt-in forms to support this practice. The reasons Black folks hit their children are supremely complex. Black Americans have been allowed to legally parent their children for only 150 years. Slave parents whipped their young to prepare them for the harsh realities of plantation life and to protect them from abuse at the hands of masters, overseers, and other whites who only valued Black life as a means to profit. During Jim Crow, whipping was used as a survival tactic to teach Black children proper racial etiquette so they would not risk being beaten or lynched by whites. The practice is now a trusted form of resistance to racism because we're convinced it does more to help than to harm. However, no reputable research has ever supported this. In fact, what 50 years of research around the world has shown is that when we hit children, we're often sowing the seeds for the very behaviors and negative outcomes that whippings are supposed to prevent, namely disobedience, aggression, dishonesty, antisocial behavior, mental health problems, poor educational achievement, low self-esteem, early puberty, risky sex, and a host of other issues. Whippings are literally changing brain chemistry and the brain's physical architecture. The stress our children face is putting them at risk for chronic health problems over their lifespan, and the trauma is even being passed on to future generations through their DNA. We can decrease these risk factors for our children if we would consider parenting practices that avoid hitting. But I know that even if Jesus Christ himself came down and said, stop whooping your kids, there will be a lot of folks who do it anyway. I expect skeptics. I know some of you don't think that I have a leg to stand on because I'm not a parent. I'm humble enough to admit that I don't know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night to a screaming child. I don't know what it's like to have a child I birthed disrespect me to the point where I want to slap her into next week. I don't know what it's like for my heart to be on edge each time my son walks out the door to go to school or to the store, fearing that he might return in a body bag. I get why people have been so quick to dismiss the information I share, because they believe a childless person cannot possibly understand this reality. Parenting is damn hard. Though I may not have children, unlike a lot of people who do have them, I haven't forgotten what it feels like to be a child. Choosing a non-hitting option will take a lot of work and a lot of creativity, self-control, and patience, but we must call all forms of hitting children by their real name: violence. This means we have to do some deep reflection and wrestle with the contradictions of our families, upbringing, and religions. It means that we have to dare to imagine what it means to raise intellectually, spiritually, and socially free Black children. I mean, absolutely free. Just as whippings won't save Black America, nor will our silence. Let me be clear. I don't want to talk about what's wrong with Black people, but rather how racist systems and policies have created a hostile environment that has caused levels of trauma that have resulted in our hurting one another. While Black parents and caretakers may perpetuate cycles of pain and trauma when they whip their children, white America, the grand Yoda of violence, despite positioning itself as a source of civility, is always supplying the ingredients for our problems. My hope is that this book will help my people enter into a conscious awareness of how whipping children is part of an unhealthy social conditioning rooted in the history of racial trauma and plays a role in preventing us from healing and thriving as people. If we really believe that whipping is a Black thing, or that we have some innate predisposition to pain and suffering, then where is there room for change, for growth, and for us to create new possibilities? We have a saying in our culture: what goes on in this house stays in this house. But whooping your child is not just an individual event that takes place between you and your child within the privacy of your home. Humiliating or inflicting pain onto your child's body is a social experience that reinforces society's oppressive power structures. Whooping our children encourages them to accept violence as normal and natural and to demand respect through violence. When Black folks participate in this kind of ritualized violence under the guise of teaching, love, and protection, we are colluding in the continued subordination of our race. We have a responsibility to ensure that we prepare the next generations of Black children to continue the struggle for racial equality. We cannot achieve this with children who are physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually broken. We cannot save our communities and achieve peace and prosperity with young, fearful people who grew up believing obedience is their greatest virtue. We should work to nurture our children to become curious, resourceful young people who endlessly push the boundaries and become the kinds of adults who change the world instead of being changed or victimized by it, including a racist one. I firmly believe that sparing the rod and restructuring the Black family as a liberated, violence-free zone is one of the strategies we cannot live without. I don't pretend to have easy or definitive answers and interventions for the remarkably complex issues that this book explores. But here's what I do know about our brilliance. African Americans are the descendants of the survivors of the Middle Passage, centuries of American slavery and Jim Crow era genocidal violence. After all that Black folks have been through in this country for almost 400 years, now is not the time for more self-inflicted pain and trauma. We can raise resistance, or we can raise order. The hard truth is, every time we whip our kids, it says we believe America's racist message about our humanity, that the only way to make us healthy, responsible, law-abiding, moral, and loving people is through a good whipping. And do we really believe this?